wabarakatuh. My name is Salma Afian, and today I would like to answer one mega question for exam reading. First is, why did you choose this article? Before that, I would like to answer what the article I choose. First is the impact of English podcast on listening skill improvement, perspective of student Universitas Advent Indonesia. Second is using podcast to improve students' listening skill in learning English. The third is the use of podcast as a tool for enhancing listening and speaking skill in English language education at 7th grade of SMP Haurius Maria. And the fourth is podcast pedagogy, transforming listening comprehension education. And the last is the effectiveness of English podcast for first semester students' listening ability at Universitas Bhinneka PGRI. Why did I choose this article? Is because I chose this 5 articles because they discuss the same topic, namely the use English podcast in improving student listening skill. Also, they focus on similar issues. Each article used different research design, participants, educational levels, and research objective. Some articles examine student perspective, perceptions, and while students measure learning outcomes through experimental methods. By comparing these studies, I can understand the topic more comprehensive and identify rich gap for my own study, my future study. Furthermore, these articles are recent publication from 2021 and to 2026, making them relevant reference for current research in English language teaching, or ELT. They also provide strong theoretical foundation, practical classroom implications, and different methodological approach. Secondly, what are the interesting part of those articles? Each article offers interesting contributions. The first article is Ani and Panjaitan 2026. It focuses on students' perception of English podcast. It explains not only the benefits but also the challenges students experience, such as unfamiliar vocabulary and fast speech. I find it interesting because it investigates learning a real experience instead of only measuring test score. And the second is the article by Rosidah 2025 uses classroom action research. The researchers conduct two learning cycles and prove the students' listening ability improve the using podcast. The combination of qualitative and quantitative data makes the finding more convincing. The third article by Winata et al. 2024 is interesting because it examines both listening and speaking skill simultaneously. Unlike the other studies, it all use a quasi-experimental design with a control and experimental groups, providing stronger evidence regarding the effectiveness of podcasts. The fourth article by Wijayanti and Annie 2024 addresses the concept of podcast pedagogy instead of simply discussing podcasts as media. It explains how podcasts can transform listening instruction using educational theories such as the SAMR model. This broader educational perspective makes the article unique. The first article by Nugrahini and Rahmadani 2021 present different findings from the other studies. It reports that English podcasts didn't produce statistically significant difference in students' listening ability. Also, students still perceive podcasts as a useful learning media. This contrasting result is interesting because it reminds researching that learning media may not always produce significant statistical improvements. The third question is, which part do you like most and will you adopt for your own article? The part I like most, the most methodology used by Winata et al. 2024, the quasi-experimental design with a pre-test, treatment, post-test, and control group provides stronger evidence. of the effectiveness of podcasts that describe studies. The design minimizes bias and allow researchers to compare learning outcome objective and also like the literature review presented by Wijayanti and Annie 2024 because it connects podcast use with educational theory instead of only discussing previous research. This makes the theoretical framework stronger and more meaningful. From Annie and Panjaitan 2026, I would adopt the discussion of the students' perceptions and learning strategies because students' opinion can provide valuable insight into how podcasts support independent learning. Overall, I will combine a strong theoretical framework and experimental research design and studying and student perceptions to produce a more comprehensive research article. Whereas if you focus on the same topic, what will you do make your article better than theirs? If I conduct research of the same topic, I will improve several aspects. First, I will use a mixed method research designed by combining quantitative and qualitative approach. Besides measuring student listening score, I will also conduct interviews to understand students' learning experience more deeply. Second, I will involve a large number of participants from several universities of schools to improve the generalizability of this finding. Third, I will compare different types podcasts such as educational podcast, storytelling podcast, and interview podcast to determine type which type contributes most to listening improvement. Fourth, I will conduct a longer treatment period, for example 8 to 12 weeks, because language learning requires continuous exposure to achieve significant improvement. Finally, I will examine the additional variables such as learning motivation, vocabulary acquisitions, learning autonomy, and speaking confidence. And this factor may explain why podcasts are effective for some learners but less effective for others. By addressing this aspect, my research will provide more comprehensive evidence and practical recommendation for English language teacher. And for the last, after reading these 5 articles, I learned that English podcasts have a great potential to improve listening skills and create a more engaging learning experience. However, the effectiveness of podcasts it depends on several factors, including teaching method, learning duration, students, motivation, and then research design. This article also told me that a good research article should have a clear research gap, a strong theoretical foundation, a proof methodology, and meaningful discussion. They have inspired me to conduct future research that combines rigorous methodology with a practical classroom applications. That's all for me to answer question from Amiga exam. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.